Welcome to another episode of the ValueFirst video podcast. This time, we're going to talk about stakeholders, and we're going to start right off with user stories. Are you using user stories? If so, we have some bad news. You're in trouble. Why is that, Tom?
Because it's too narrow. It doesn't look at the whole system. And as Elon Musk was reminding us in our last podcast, we have to think of the whole system, not just a narrow subsection of them. And user is extremely narrow. It's like 1/50th of the sources of requirements that you have to consider.
Okay, but why can't you consider all the requirements with user stories? What do you mean?
Well, you can consider all the requirements and call them user stories, but they're no longer user stories because the whole point is to get the requirements you need to make the system that will succeed. That's almost poetic, isn't it? And
But you're not explaining what's wrong with user stories here. Why can't you do this with user stories?
you can do the user part of it with the user stories, but you can't do all the other type of stakeholders, of which there are very many. There are even 5 broad categories of stakeholders. One of them is the kind of thing that people like Google and Facebook forget. It's the laws, like the European laws for privacy. Okay, they are a stakeholder. Stakeholder is defined as an entity that has requirements that are critical that we have to worry about. Otherwise, we fail. Okay, so if it's the difference between success and failure in your systems and your projects. We have far too high a level of failure, and it's partly caused by ignoring the needs of stakeholders and focusing too much on the users. Nothing wrong with the users. We got to get all those other players, those other stakeholders in there, those that will kill our product or project, we need to get in there. Those that will help us succeed, we need to get them in there and get their requirements on the table at the same time as the user requirements. Otherwise, we might succeed with the users and fail with the European Commission, which will shut down our project or product.
So maybe I need to point out the obvious here. It's like the user part. So we have over-focus on one stakeholder, the user, as in user stories. So, emphasize on the user part. Where are all the other stakeholders?
Yeah, they're out there hiding, waiting to kill your project when you least expect it after you spent years and millions. And suddenly the law of the European Union comes out and pounces on you and says, your product will not be allowed to be sold in the European Union, and we will fine you $7 million this week.
Yeah, because the law is not considered
a user.
A user.
But it's a stakeholder, and it's a powerful stakeholder. And that's just one example. So what we're recommending is that you change user stories to stakeholder stories. Nothing wrong with the stories. It could be a little bit more sophisticated, as we talked about earlier, but the point is to broaden your scope to look at all the critical requirements. Critical requirements are requirements that are going to cause success or failure in your project. You want all the critical requirements. The only way you're going to get them is to look beyond the users to the other stakeholders. And that includes non-human stakeholders such as laws, regulations, standards, procedures, customs. They're not who you can't interview them. The business analyst isn't used to the idea of talking to them. But they've got to be on your list of entities that give you critical requirements that you have to consider before you do, for example, your architecture. Not afterwards. Before you test your system, they have to be part of, you have to test that you have delivered the critical values that these other stakeholders also require.
You said it. Okay, we're going to go on just a little thing. Okay, so value first is a way of succeeding in product development. So if you are interested in succeeding in product development, this podcast might be interesting for you. If you're not really interested in succeeding in projects, if you have some other interests in life, which many of us have, then this podcast is probably not for you. And the value first is just a way of saying, hey, the most important thing to do is to understand the values of the stakeholders, right? The stakeholders, the users, the systems, they have values, and that is really the most determining factor for how successful a product or service is. So, and somehow in the industry, this focus is totally missing.
It does exist in mature disciplines such as systems engineering, people building spaceships and military systems. They have long since understood they have many stakeholders, and the stakeholders need to be addressed. Otherwise, the rocket ship does not land on Mars. That simple. Okay, so they're mature, but there are many other disciplines. Let's roughly tackle the IT sector, anything to do with software, and the management sector. We have bought into this idea that user stories is the primary source of requirements. They're important, but there's some equally important stuff with the other stakeholder categories. So you need to have a systematic list of your stakeholders. They're individual for your project. You have to learn the hard way sometimes, which stakeholders you have to listen to or you're going to get problems. And you have to be willing to learn about new stakeholders as your project goes on. They will emerge at certain stages.
They'll come and bite you in the butt, right?
Yep, and you got to get them as early as possible and deal with them as early as possible. That's where agile comes in. You have to be agile enough to recognize a new stakeholder or a new critical stakeholder need and grab it and integrate it into your thinking, into your model of your project right away. You don't wait until the European Commission says you're not allowed on the market. That's too late.
Is there anything in Agile or Scrum that you know of that says shouldn't do stakeholder analysis?
No, these are open frameworks, and you can bring in anything you need, and you all need to bring stakeholders in.
That's right.
The user story emphasis is an unnecessarily narrow simplification for small-scale systems.
Now, before user stories,
Yep.
before Agile maybe, I mean, or even without user stories, there are other techniques, right? So how are the other standards when it comes to bringing in stakeholder analysis and using that to create values and requirements?
Well, before that, we simply had a thing called requirements, and you got requirements from wherever. So what happened was somebody said, but we're not very good at being user-friendly. So that was a good decision to move in the direction of user-friendly systems. But it became, the pendulum swung a little bit too far. So it was like only users. And we're beginning to forget the other stakeholders. So the primary idea is to get the critical requirements, meaning those requirements that will determine whether you succeed or fail somehow. And analyzing stakeholders is merely a tool or a process that ensures that you will probably get most of the critical requirements. The moment you start with user stories, you're doomed to not get 50% to 90% of the critical requirements. And you'll get them, but you'll get them late, middle of the project, end of the project.
Biting
delays,
you in the ass.
Overruns, right? So the trick is to get them as early as possible. And by saying, let's analyze our stakeholders, you've increased the probability by 99%. Well, it sounds like a good number, right? of actually identifying the critical things at an early stage where it's about 100 times cheaper to deal with it when you're doing your, for example, your architecture of your system. You don't want to have to redo your architecture because you forgot critical stakeholders.
Let's move away from user stories.
Okay.
Let's focus on stakeholders.
Okay.
Okay, so how do we, you said analyze.
Yeah.
How do we get the stakeholders in the first place? How do we know who are the stakeholders we need to consider in a project? How many are there?
Right. Well, a typical medium-sized project will have 30 to 50 stakeholders. Not one, and one of them may be the user, or in fact, different kinds of users. Okay. Now, one systematic approach is that we have basic categories of stakeholders. So let's start with individuals like the chief technical officer, the marketing officer. Then there's a category called organizational entities, such as marketing or product development or something like that. Those are maybe there are 5 or 10 of those organizational entities. Then there are what we call weak victims. These are people like, for example, if you're building a system for the government, people who need medical aid or financial aid or something like that, children, widows, and they're not users of the system at all. There may be some government employee who's using the system on their behalf, but they're not users of the system. But you have to consider them and the kind of information we need from them and their interaction with the system. So we call them weak victims. Then there are helpers of the weak victims. These are like the council employee trying to help the old widow get her pension or something like that. And there's a whole category there. And not least, and often forgotten, are the inanimate stakeholders. As we mentioned earlier, these are things like laws, regulations, standards, plans. They're typically written, but they do contain critical requirements. And so you have to have a systematic list of what are the inanimate things. Are we impacted by European law, by local council regulations, by the master plan of the CEO for the corporation, that kind of thing. There are really important requirements there. Otherwise, you're going to get a problem with these when the CEO discovers that you're not in sync with his master plan for the corporation. And therefore, your whole project is wasting time and money and your budget needs to be cut. Okay. So in other words, having these 5 or 6 major categories is a good start. Now,
another category which is really, a major, can start off a lot of times. We just to help people think about the stakeholders in their project, what they can do is they can think about 2 categories: internal stakeholders, internal to the company. And typically, unless you're delivering a system internally, that's not where you find the user, right? But the people who needs, the developers, the people who need to maintain the systems, the testers, the salespeople, maybe if they're internal, the management. I mean, there are all kinds of internal stakeholders, and then external stakeholders, which then you start going out. Maybe start with a user, but then you start thinking about all those things that Tom just mentioned, like the law and the competitors and the people who wants to do harm and the your old system
and by the way, one stakeholder doesn't have one requirement. Okay, one stakeholder might have 2 requirements or 5, and some of those requirements might be held in common with other stakeholders, but perhaps the other stakeholders want different levels of privacy or security or some other value like that. So, in other words, there's not a simple set of values that you get from one stakeholder, one value, nobody else has it. It's just not that simple. So you have to be able to model or map somehow the stakeholders, their values, and the fact that these values are also held by other stakeholders, and you're going to have to resolve the discrepancy or the difference between the different types of security that different stakeholders require, for example.
Another twist of that is, let's say you take the user. And is that one stakeholder? Well, if you have different types of users that require different types of values or different requirements, then you need to split them up into maybe an advanced user, a medium level, and a beginner user. For instance, could be have 3 completely different needs on the system. Yep. So I get that question a lot. It's like, well, should I just keep this as one category? Well, the thing is, do the people within that category have different needs? If yes, you need to split it up and have maybe 10 different types of users, stakeholders in 10 different groups, because they are maybe speak different languages. Yeah? Users from Norway might be different than users from UK or Germany.
Now, usually people learn about these stakeholders and their critical needs the hard way, by hard experience, by getting delays and having to redo systems and budget overruns. We emphasize you will learn about these stakeholders and critical needs sooner or later. And our point is that you need to learn as early as possible, as cheaply as possible. And that requires a little bit more upfront thinking. A stitch in time saves 9, as the old saying goes. And you invest in stakeholder analysis so you don't have to spend 10 times as much later in your project just before the deadline. Another thing is people learn on one major project, you will learn what your stakeholders are if you analyze, do a retrospective of some kind. What went wrong? What did we not see? But if you keep a list of all the stakeholders you use on one major project, then in the same corporation, you'll find that list is a very good starting checklist for the next project. You need to reuse the knowledge and not build it up from scratch every time with beginners. So you need to have a place where you say our typical stakeholder list and the typical critical needs we know they have. So you need to reuse the knowledge systematically, share the knowledge, and accumulate the knowledge. That'll give you a flying start every time, and it's much cheaper to do it that way.
So a company should have its own, list of stakeholders that they can reuse from project to project. And also, I think a lot of times what people have is they have a product and then they launch, and then they're going to launch version 2 and 3 and 4 as the years goes by. And then they should just keep the same stakeholders and, of course, adjust as people move in.
A cumulative list.
Move in and out. But it's a fairly stable list. Of course, there will be changes, but it's a fairly stable list. So the question is, does your company have a list of stakeholders that when you start a project, you can go to as a sort of inspiration and make sure that you have considered all the stakeholders?
Yeah. Go try to find your stakeholder list. I'll bet you cannot do it. I'll bet you're not doing it. There's a famous saying by Santayana, those who do not learn from history of stakeholders, he could have said, are doomed to repeat it. In other words, to get the same problems over and over again and never learn. Okay, so are you going to mature, grow up, learn to deal with your stakeholders and their critical needs at the earliest possible stages and save time and money and get it right? This is a sign of maturity.
Yeah, we talk about maturity, but it's not like super advanced, difficult to do.
Nope.
It's actually basic, right? If you don't have this list of stakeholders, you are at the ground level of maturity, I would say. I mean, it's such a simple thing. Now, so how would you go about doing this in a company? I guess, if you have somebody responsible for methods, they could maybe be the responsible person to just make a list on a Wikipedia or whoever database, whatever system that you use internally. You just keep and maintain a stakeholder list that everybody can access.
Right. And you have some procedures or standards, and you need to look at, does it say this is where we analyze our stakeholders and their critical requirements? So I often use the term critical stakeholders, defined as stakeholders that have critical requirements. And what you're looking for are the critical requirements, the critical values. These are the ones that if they're too low, they kill your project. If they're high enough, they help you get success. So it's a success failure idea. Are you tired of your projects being delayed? Are you tired of your projects disappointing people? Are you tired of your projects failing? Because about over 50% of projects fail, whether we admit it publicly or not. Then one key idea is stakeholder analysis, systematic learning from history, stakeholder analysis, identifying critical values, identifying the levels of the values that the stakeholders, your stakeholders need, not just in general. Okay. Do they need 99% probability of detecting a hacker within 10 minutes or 99.9% probability of detecting within 3 picoseconds. Okay, different users have different value needs, and the level of the value is critical. That is, it determines whether those stakeholders say, this is a failure for me, I will have nothing to do with the system. Okay.
So actually, the very first thing we normally do when we come in and are helping projects is to make a list of the stakeholders. It's the first thing to do. Because that's where we get the next step that Tom was saying, the critical requirements that these stakeholders want. So it makes no sense to start in the other end. You need to, as soon as possible, get into get a list of the stakeholders. And not only that, if we come into a project, sometimes we come in the middle to help them out. Either they're completely failing or they're just in the middle and they are seeking some help. What's the first thing we do? We start looking for, well, where's the stakeholder list? Well, it's missing. Okay, let's create the list and make sure that we've covered the needs of all the stakeholders. Otherwise, we are going to fail. It's as simple as that.
If we walk in and say, show me your requirements, and we get a bunch of user stories, dead giveaway. They are immature. We are too polite to say that, to say, let's take a look at the other stakeholders too. Okay, but it's a dead giveaway if your culture is very user-centered. I was working at a conference called, where they're very focused on user experience, UX. And everybody's a user experience person, all user experience UX designers. And I had to tease them in the keynote I held. And I said, next time I come to this conference, I hope the conference will be called SX, Stakeholder Experience. So what is the stakeholder experience? We've got to get, in other words, the user is not a bad idea, it's a good idea. But it's 1/50th of what you have to consider to be sure of succeeding at the lowest possible cost and timing. Okay, you got to bring in those other stakeholder needs at the earliest possible moment. That means sometimes the first day and the first week. If you want to know what earliest possible moment means.
Yeah, it's usually the very first thing we do.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
It's just the foundation of everything else that we need to create success. Do we have any examples of companies that do stakeholder analysis and using stakeholders well?
Well, we hope that when we've worked with a client, they're doing it after that. But the only companies that we walk into and expect it, those are the aerospace and military companies, because that's part of the culture for decades. It's a bad thing if you lose a war and your nation collapses because you didn't do your stakeholder analysis. So they've had to figure that out the hard way. But as often as they don't need our help with that. So we're usually dealing with IT and management situations where there is no stakeholder culture at the moment. They don't even mention the words. They haven't even rejected it. They haven't even thought of it. And we have to walk in and say, thanks for your user stories, but let's go beyond user stories. Let's take a look at all your critical requirements. And that means we start with all your critical stakeholders. And for example, simple things like, what legal requirements do we have for, say, security and privacy? And the stakeholder is the law that we have to follow, for example, in the European Union.
Keep talking.
Keep talking.
Do something. What I'm going to do is, I just thought of this Luwat that we mentioned in the previous podcast. Yeah. They actually, after we worked with them, they did a fantastic stakeholder analysis and did some graphic representation of them, which is kind of cool. So I'm going to show that.
Okay, good.
While I look for that, why don't you say something cool about stakeholders? Or something else. This week, did you come over anything maybe not stakeholder, maybe stakeholder related? Did you write something? Did you read something?
Yeah, this week I was working with some friends of ours in the construction industry, and we're working on the United Nations sustainability goals, and in particular the ones regarding innovation. And make a long story short, you take a look at those United Nations projects, save the world kind of things. The quantity of real stakeholders out there for the whole project is mind blowing. We're talking thousands at the very least. And then if you narrow into these people's perspective, which is the building and construction industry, and you narrow in again to one of the United Nations sustainability goals. By the way, I'll send anybody a free copy of my new book, Sustainability Planning, as I mentioned last time, and I've already sent some out from the last podcast. So even when you've narrowed in to the construction industry and the innovation goal number 9, you still have an enormous number of stakeholders. Okay, so and it's not as simple as a user by any means. 99% of your stakeholders are just not users.
Let me. So I found this ValueWatt, some slides that I have, and I'm gonna show them right now. So here we are. This is Tom and me. This is the lead of the project. This is an engineer, and this is another consultant. Here's Virginia, and what she has mapped the stakeholders very visually to the various requirements. So we're gonna go in here now. So here they were looking for funds from the Gates Foundation.
Money.
Now those guys,
millions of dollars,
and those guys, they're not using the toilets, right? These toilets are, they're for Madagascar. They're for villages, not for Bill Gates. But Gates here is one of the key stakeholders that they mapped these values to. So then they quantified the values that they thought that Gates would be interested in.
And you better please Gates, because they're the ones providing the money for funding the project.
So what happened, as we mentioned earlier, is they won among hundreds of projects, all looking for the funds. They won the $1 million. It's quite kind of amazing. You can imagine there were hundreds of other projects, ideas for how to do toilets and how to do hygiene. It was more like hygiene related, I think, and disease prevention related. And instead of just focusing on, oh, here's a toilet and the user this and the user that, they looked at all the stakeholders, where Gates Foundation was one of them, and they looked at, well, what would they be interested in? So when they presented the project, the things that the Gates Foundation was interesting was clear and center. So so the Gates Foundation, when they received all these ideas for projects that needed funding, one was standing out. And it was the guys who did the ValueFirst methods that had taken the time to analyze the stakeholders and what values they were looking for. So the Gates were interested in sustainability, sanitation, a good story to tell, knowledge, risk, what's the risk of this working, not working, etc., and even methodology. Now, here's one of these values, sanitation. There's a bigger case study, but that's what I wanted to show. So here are some of the other stakeholders, NGOs, the community, ValueWatt itself, internal stakeholders, there's other sponsors, the media. These are not users of toilets, but they are sure important to succeed if you want to create, a project like a toilet. Media can help you a lot. The government of Madagascar, etc. So just wanted to show that. I thought that was really cool what they did.
Yeah, it's a very good example.
All right. So that's all we have on stakeholders.
Yeah, that's enough. Get you started. But I wrote another new book this summer called Value Requirements. And it's not even on our website. It's not being sold. But it does go into depth about stakeholders and how you use them. And if you send me a little email and say, I promise to read your book this week, Tom, and give you some feedback, I'll send you a free copy of my most advanced and latest book on value requirements.
Excellent. That's
you have to figure out how to ask me and where to ask me. If you're not smart enough to do that, no point in you reading the book.
all right. So thank you very much. This week we talked about stakeholders. You better start including them in your project.
Especially the ones that give you money for your project.
You better start including them. You better find who they are as early as possible in your project. And then you better ask, what are their needs? What are their interests? What are their requirements?
Critical requirements. And accumulate the knowledge from project to project. Build a culture of it. Don't do it one-off every time from scratch.
And if you are responsible for methods in some form or way in your company, you better take the responsibility to create a list of stakeholders that everybody in the company can access.
And their typical critical values, maybe quantified levels and some experiences. Yeah?
Tom Gilb, Kai Gilb, thank you very much.
Have fun.